A black climber found old iron rails embedded in a cliff and decided to follow them inside. What he discovered in the abandoned mine nearly cost him his life and forced the authorities to immediately close the entire area. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. The mountain had no name on any popular map, and that was exactly why he was here. It rose from the tangled forest like a broken tooth, its dark face streaked with ice scars and vertical veins of bare stone, too remote to tempt weekend climbers and too awkward to justify the expense of any commercial expedition. The approach alone took 2 full days of bushwhacking through fallen timber, frozen marshland, and avalanche debris, followed by a night spent wedged between wind-polished boulders while the temperature sank far below anything that felt humane. In the morning, the peak revealed itself properly, the summit hidden behind slow-moving cloud, the lower walls slashed with cracks that looked less like invitations and more like warnings. He had chosen it not because it promised glory, but because it promised silence. For years he had sought out routes that no one talked about, lines that did not trend on social media and were not decorated with bolts or chalk. Being a dark-skinned climber in a world that still quietly categorized adventurers by expectation had shaped him more than he liked to admit. In busy climbing hubs, he was always the one who stood out, not just for his height or his way of moving, but for existing in places people did not subconsciously imagine him belonging. Out here, alone beneath a nameless wall, none of that mattered. There was no one to impress, no one to contradict. The rock either held him or it did not. He had studied satellite images for weeks before committing to the trip, enlarging grainy patches of shadow until his eyes burned, looking for subtle lines that suggested continuity through the broken cliff bands. He had found one, a faint diagonal trace halfway up the face, too regular to be random but too faint to explain. The rational part of his mind insisted it was nothing more than an illusion of light and erosion. Another part, the one that had carried him through failures and near misses, whispered that mountains sometimes kept secrets visible only to those who stared long enough. The first hours on the wall were merciless. The lower section consisted of shattered limestone layered like wet cardboard, every hold a negotiation with gravity. He moved slowly, testing each edge before committing his weight, letting his muscles warm in increments rather than in bursts. The wind clawed at his jacket, funneling upward along the face and draining heat through fabric and skin, until his fingertips tingled with a dangerous numbness. Several times he had to pause simply to flex his hands and breathe warmth into them, watching the condensation vanish instantly into the cold air. As he gained height, the terrain changed in ways that unsettled him. The natural cracks that should have wandered unpredictably instead began to align, forming shallow steps that seemed oddly consistent in width and depth. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, an accident of stratified rock, but the pattern persisted. There were even faint horizontal lines, barely raised ridges in the stone that caught ice and shadow in a way that made them stand out when the sun shifted. He had never seen anything like it in untouched alpine walls. He reached a narrow stance where he could stand with both feet, clipped into a cam wedged deep into a crevice, and took a moment to let his pulse slow. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had retreated, leaving only the faintest hum in his ears. He leaned his helmeted head back and scanned upward, following the strange geometry of the rock. That was when he saw the glint. It was not bright, not even obvious. Just a sliver of dull reflection where there should have been none. a patch of color that did not belong to the mineral palette of the cliff. He thought of a carabiner dropped by a careless climber decades earlier, half swallowed by stone. Curious but cautious, he shifted upward, placing a series of small cams and nuts with the mechanical care that had become second nature to him. When he was close enough to touch the anomaly, he reached out with his right hand, expecting the familiar chill of rock. His glove met iron. The sensation jolted him more than any slip could have. He recoiled instinctively, then leaned back in, brushing the surface free of frost with the side of his hand. The shape that emerged was unmistakable. A rail, narrow and heavily corroded, but a rail nonetheless, its top worn smooth by 1,000 forgotten passages. It was embedded directly into the cliff face, fixed with bolts so old they had bloomed into fragile halos of rust. His breath fogged the air inside his helmet as he stared. This was no fragment fallen from above. The metal was aligned horizontally, parallel to the faint lines he had been noticing for the last hour. Heart pounding, he scanned left and right and found it again, the twin strip of iron running alongside the first at a precise distance, forming a pair that could only be part of a track system. For a long minute, he did nothing but hold on and think. Mountains swallowed all manner of human debris, but this was too deliberate, too organized to be dismissed. His eyes followed the rails along the wall until they disappeared into a dark fissure higher up, a slit in the stone that looked no different from 1,000 other alpine fractures unless you knew what to look for. The rational voice in his head grew louder, urging retreat. He was alone, high on an uncharted route, and the weather was already turning. But curiosity had always been his most faithful companion, and it leaned closer now, heavy with promise. He secured himself with an extra piece of protection and inched upward, moving with exaggerated care as the holds became smaller and more awkward. The rails offered no real support, their surfaces slick with corrosion and ice, but they guided his eyes and, strangely, his sense of direction. When he reached the fissure, he felt a faint draft of air spill across his knuckles, colder and drier than the wind outside, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the open mountain. It was the smell of confinement, of stone that had not breathed freely in generations. He wedged a knee into the crack and twisted his torso sideways, peeling off his pack and pushing it ahead of him through the opening. The rock scraped his shoulders and helmet, but the space widened just enough to admit him. On the other side, the mountain opened its mouth. The crack did not lead into darkness so much as into absence. His headlamp beam stretched forward and was swallowed, revealing a passage whose walls bore the unmistakable scars of human labor. Pick marks lined the sides in rhythmic patterns, and the floor was unnaturally flat, sloping inward at a shallow but constant angle. The rails continued, their rusted spines vanishing deeper into the rock, as though they had always belonged there. Cold settled around him like a weight. The air inside was several degrees lower than outside, preserved by centuries of isolation. Moisture glistened on the walls, and the sound of his own breathing seemed to echo back at him from unseen distances. He stood motionless for a moment, adjusting to the shift, then took a cautious step forward, mindful of how fragile everything suddenly felt. As he moved, more details emerged from the gloom. Fragments of timber lay scattered along the edges of the tunnel, some reduced to soft, splintered ghosts, others stubbornly intact where the mountain's dryness had preserved them. Rusted tools were half buried in dust and grit, their handles worn smooth by hands that had once trusted them. Here and there, iron brackets jutted from the walls, empty now but clearly once used to hold lamps or cables. He followed the track, counting his steps without realizing it, driven by a need to impose order on a place that defied logic. Every instinct told him this was not just an old mine, but a system, something larger than the narrow corridor he currently occupied. The rails curved gently, tracing the shape of the mountain rather than cutting straight through it, and the slope grew steeper the farther he went. With each meter, the sense of intrusion deepened. The tunnel felt less like a relic and more like a sleeping organism, undisturbed and vaguely resentful of his presence. Small stones dislodged under his boots, skittering away into the darkness ahead, and he froze each time, heart thudding, listening for any response from the unseen depths. There was none, only the distant drip of water and the soft rasp of his own movements. At a bend, where the wall on his left bulged inward, he nearly tripped over a collapsed beam. It had fallen across the rails at an angle, pinning a small ore cart in place as though someone had abandoned it mid-task. The cart's wheels were seized with rust, their rims flaking at a touch, and a layer of black dust coated everything, thick enough to smear under his fingers. Coal, he realized, feeling the gritty residue between his gloves. This place had not been carved for silver or gold. It had been built to feed fires. He straightened slowly, looking past the cart and into the widening dark beyond. The tunnel no longer felt narrow. It felt like the beginning of something vast, something engineered with a confidence that only the 19th century had possessed, when mountains were obstacles to be conquered rather than landscapes to be admired. He felt a tremor of awe at the thought of men hauling steel and timber up this very cliff face, driving rails into solid rock in defiance of gravity and common sense. A faint, metallic groan echoed somewhere deep inside the mountain, so distant it might have been his imagination. He waited, muscles coiled, until the silence returned. Only then did he move again, stepping carefully around the abandoned cart and following the rails as they led him farther into the forgotten heart of the peak, unaware that the true danger was not the darkness ahead, but the history it concealed. The deeper he went, the more the mountain seemed to close around him, as if the passage he had entered were not a relic of human ambition, but a natural vein that had reluctantly allowed itself to be shaped by foreign hands. The tunnel curved gently to the right, and the narrow rails continued beneath his boots, their tops polished to a dull sheen by decades of friction long before rust had claimed them. He moved slowly, forcing himself to stay calm, aware that he had crossed an invisible threshold. A few minutes earlier, he had been on an exposed cliff, subject to wind and gravity. Now, he was inside the mountain itself, guided by iron that had no business being here. He stopped where the tunnel widened enough to allow him to stand without brushing his shoulders against the walls. There, he knelt and brushed away a crust of frozen grit from one of the rails, exposing the unmistakable profile beneath. This was not a scrap of rebar or a stray beam. It was a narrow-gauge track, deliberately shaped and fixed into place with bolts whose heads were still visible where corrosion had not entirely erased them. He traced one with his glove, feeling the cratered surface and the flaking metal that came away in brittle curls. The realization crept over him slowly, like the return of circulation to a numbed limb. These rails had not been dragged here by accident or avalanche. They had been installed, aligned, and maintained with care. Somewhere outside, on the sheer wall he had been climbing, there had to be more. Fragments he had mistaken for quirks of the rock until now. The faint horizontal ridges, the oddly consistent ledges, all of it assembled itself in his mind into a picture that was as impossible as it was undeniable. There had once been a railway system clinging to that cliff face, feeding into this tunnel like a vein into a heart. He stood and followed the line of metal deeper, counting each tie plate he passed, some intact, others broken or missing, their outlines preserved in stains on the stone. At intervals, he found holes drilled into the walls at a uniform height, the remains of old fixtures that had once supported lamps or cables. The air here carried a different quality, less damp than he expected, dry enough to preserve the wood fragments he stepped over in places. The mountain had sealed this place from the rhythms of weather, creating a cold vault in which time moved reluctantly. As he progressed, the geometry of the passage shifted. The tunnel widened just enough to reveal that the rails were not merely laid along the floor but had been guided by deliberate shaping of the rock itself. The walls bore the scars of chisels and hammers, their repetitive patterns softened by mineral seepage, but still visible in the oblique light of his headlamp. It was clear that the builders had followed the path of least resistance through the mountain, weaving around denser sections rather than blasting straight through. This was craftsmanship, not brute force. He reached a point where the rails began to climb more steeply, the incline so regular that it could not have been an accident of geology. The faint smell of coal grew stronger, a dry, acrid undertone beneath the sterile scent of stone. He imagined the men who had once labored here, pushing carts or guiding them with cables, their voices swallowed by the same walls that now returned only his own breath. The tunnel bent sharply and brought him to a ledge where the floor dropped away on one side into darkness. The rails did not end there. They curved outward and then vanished into shadow, suspended over a void that his light could not penetrate. He knelt at the edge, careful to distribute his weight, and aimed his lamp downward. The beam traced a sheer drop for several seconds before dissolving into black, suggesting a cavernous space beyond the narrow confines he had known so far. The sense of scale shifted abruptly, like stepping from a hallway into a cathedral. He was no longer in a simple mined passage. This was infrastructure, the spine of a system that had once operated on a grander vision than the cramped corridor suggested. The bolts embedded in the walls grew larger here, their threads thick enough to anchor serious loads. Some still held fragments of iron brackets, twisted into grotesque shapes by forces that had not been gentle. He straightened slowly, aware that the stakes had changed. Whatever lay ahead had not been built for convenience or safety. It had been built to serve an industrial purpose at the very edge of what the mountain would allow. The rails were not simply leading him inward, they were leading him downward, toward a deeper heart of stone that had not seen human presence since the century turned. He took another step and felt a subtle vibration beneath his boot, the echo of his own movement traveling along the iron. It made him pause, breath caught in his throat, until he realized the sensation was not external at all. It was his own pulse, magnified by the tension that now coiled in his muscles. He was acutely aware that every sound he made was amplified in this enclosed world, that even a careless shift of weight could send a pebble skittering into the abyss beyond the ledge. The rails continued to guide him along the edge, hugging the wall with a fidelity that suggested forethought. He followed, his left hand trailing the stone for balance, until the void gave way to solid floor once more. Here, the tunnel opened into a broader corridor where the ceiling arched overhead, its curvature smoothed by centuries of mineral deposition. Water trickled down the walls in thin, glassy threads, freezing in mid-fall to form translucent fingers that glowed in his light. In this wider space, he began to find more objects, not isolated tools or fragments, but clusters of them arranged as though abandoned in haste. A coil of rope lay tangled beside the rails, its fibers brittle but intact, next to a stack of wooden planks that had never been used. Several metal cans sat in a neat row against the wall, their lids rusted shut, their labels long gone. He could not escape the impression that these items had not been lost over time, but left behind in a single, decisive moment. He bent to examine one of the cans and felt a chill unrelated to the temperature. The surface was slick, coated with a film of something that caught the light in a way that made it look wet despite the dryness of the air. He wiped his glove on his pant leg, unsettled, and stood again, scanning the area for anything that might explain the haste that had overtaken this place. There were no signs of fire or explosion, no blackened walls or collapsed ceilings, just the quiet aftermath of departure. At the far end of the corridor, the rails converged toward a narrow opening, the mouth of another tunnel that sloped more sharply downward. Beyond it, he could hear the faint whisper of moving air, a draft that suggested larger chambers below. He hesitated there, caught between the instinct to retreat while he still could and the pull of the unknown that had always defined his climbs. He thought of the cliff face outside and of the invisible path he had followed without knowing it, guided by traces of metal embedded in stone. The mountain had been speaking to him all along, in a language of geometry and corrosion that he had only just learned to understand. Now, standing at the threshold of a deeper descent, he felt as though he were being invited to complete a story begun more than a century ago. With a final glance back the way he had come, he adjusted the straps of his pack, checked the beam of his headlamp, and stepped forward into the narrowing passage, following the iron road into the heart of the mountain, unaware that each step was carrying him closer to the place where the builders of this forgotten system had met their end. The passage narrowed almost imperceptibly at first, then with a determination that forced him to change the way he moved. The rails, so faithfully parallel until now, pressed closer together as the walls leaned inward, turning the once navigable corridor into a fissure that felt more like a wound in the mountain than a constructed tunnel. He slowed his pace, angling his shoulders and easing his pack off to one side so it would not scrape against the rock. The air here had changed again, colder and sharper, as if he had passed into a deeper stratum where the mountain no longer bothered to moderate its breath. The light from his headlamp no longer revealed the reassuring order of shaped stone and spaced bolt holes. Instead, it flickered across jagged surfaces that had only partially yielded to human tools. Pick marks overlapped in confused layers, some shallow and hesitant, others deep enough to expose veins of darker mineral beneath the paler limestone. It was as though the builders had encountered a resistance here that had tested their patience, carving forward not with confidence but with grim persistence. He paused where the floor dipped suddenly, catching himself on a protruding nub of rock just in time to avoid pitching forward. His boot dislodged a pebble that skipped along the rail with a brittle clink before disappearing into the darkness ahead. The sound seemed impossibly loud, ricocheting along the confined space until he could no longer tell where it ended. He held still, listening, waiting for any answering noise from the depths. There was nothing, only the faint drip of water somewhere out of sight, a metronome counting down a history he could not see. The fissure tightened further, forcing him to turn sideways and edge along the rails with the care of someone navigating a chimney climb. His shoulder brushed the wall, leaving a smear of black dust on his jacket that smelled faintly of coal and age. The mountain pressed in on him from both sides now, its presence no longer an abstract mass but a physical constraint that dictated every breath and movement. He felt acutely the fragility of the space, the way a single shift of stone could seal him inside forever. Then, as suddenly as it had narrowed, the passage widened. He emerged into a pocket of open space that felt cavernous by comparison, a chamber no larger than a small room but free of the oppressive embrace that had preceded it. He straightened carefully, stretching muscles that had begun to protest the unnatural angles of his progress. Here, the walls bore clearer signs of deliberate shaping, the rock smoothed into planes that caught the light evenly, as if someone had tried to impose a sense of order after wrestling with the stubborn fissure behind him. The rails ran straight across the chamber and into another tunnel on the far side, this one descending at a steeper angle than any he had yet encountered. Between the two openings lay a scattering of debris that told a story more eloquently than any document could. Broken beams lay in a tangled heap near the left wall, their ends splintered as though they had snapped under sudden strain. Beside them were several tools, a pick with its handle snapped cleanly in half, a hammer head separated from its shaft, a coil of cable partially unwound and frozen in a shape that suggested it had been dropped mid-motion. He crouched to examine the cable and felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. The metal strands were frayed in places, not from slow decay, but from abrupt tearing, as though they had been pulled beyond their limits in a desperate attempt to hold something back. The idea took root in his mind that this chamber had been a site of crisis, a bottleneck where effort had turned into panic. The rails themselves bore scars here, their tops gouged and bent, the flanges on one side crushed inward. He followed the damage with his eyes and saw that it converged towards the steeper tunnel, pointing like an accusation at whatever lay beyond. It was easy to imagine a cart or a series of carts hurtling down that incline, gathering speed beyond control, the men in this chamber straining against ropes and levers that had failed them. He rose and took a tentative step toward the downward passage, peering into it with a mixture of dread and fascination. The draft he had noticed earlier was stronger here, a steady exhalation from the mountain's depths that carried with it the scent of damp stone and something else, a faint chemical sharpness that stung his nostrils. He had smelled it before in modern mines, the residue of blasting agents and lubricants, but here it was muted by age, a ghost of industry lingering in a place that had not seen work in a lifetime. The tunnel dropped away at an angle that made his stomach tighten. The rails were fitted with additional metal braces along the sides, their remains clinging to the walls like barnacles, evidence of a system designed to manage heavy loads on treacherous terrain. His headlamp revealed a pattern of notches and grooves cut into the stone beside the track, places where braking mechanisms or guide rollers had once been mounted. He stood at the threshold for a long moment, considering the implications of what he had found. This was no simple mine. No haphazard hole in the ground dug by men chasing rumors of easy wealth. This was infrastructure conceived with precision and executed with labor that must have been enormous. The cliff face he had climbed, the rails he had followed, the tunnel system now unfolding before him were all pieces of a single, audacious vision to carve a transport artery through one of the most hostile environments imaginable. The chamber around him seemed to absorb his thoughts, its stillness thick with the residue of long-forgotten urgency. He imagined the noise that must once have filled this space, the shouts, the clatter of metal on metal, the grinding of gears and the groan of timber under strain. Now there was only his own breathing, the sound amplified by the confined acoustics until it felt like an intrusion. He adjusted his grip on the rock and took another step into the downward tunnel, immediately feeling the shift in gravity tug at his center of balance. He moved carefully, placing each foot on the rail bed with deliberate precision, aware that the slope could easily turn a stumble into an uncontrollable slide. The air grew colder with every meter, the chill seeping through his boots and into his bones. As he descended, the walls pressed closer once more, though not with the chaotic resistance of the earlier fissure. Here, the narrowing felt intentional, as though the builders had deliberately constricted the space to reinforce the track and protect it from rockfall. The ceiling dipped low enough that he had to duck, and the smell of coal intensified until it seemed to coat the inside of his mouth. He passed more evidence of abrupt abandonment. A lantern lay on its side in a shallow niche, its glass shattered, its metal housing dented as though it had been flung aside. Nearby, a leather belt was draped over a rock spur, its buckle still intact, its strap stiff with age. The personal nature of these objects unsettled him more than the industrial debris had. They spoke not of systems and machines, but of individuals whose lives had intersected with this place in ways he could only imagine. The downward tunnel eventually curved, and with the curve came a subtle change in the soundscape. The whisper of moving air grew louder, resolving into a distant, hollow resonance that suggested open space ahead. His pulse quickened despite his efforts to remain composed. He was no longer merely exploring a forgotten passage. He was being drawn toward the core of whatever catastrophe had ended this operation, toward a space large enough to amplify even the faintest disturbance. He slowed his pace, allowing his senses to adjust, and became aware of a low, almost inaudible hum beneath the draft, a vibration that could have been nothing more than the mountain settling into itself, but felt, in this context, like a held breath. He followed the rails as they led him onward, the curve straightening into a gentle descent that promised to open into something far larger than the narrow tunnels he had known so far. With each step, he felt the weight of the mountain above him, a pressure that was no longer metaphorical. It pressed into his awareness, a reminder that he was walking through a place that had once been alive with purpose and had then been abandoned in a moment of crisis. Whatever had happened here had not simply stopped work. It had driven people away with enough force to leave their tools, their gear, and perhaps even parts of their lives behind. He emerged from the tunnel into a space so vast that for an instant he could not comprehend it. His light flared uselessly against darkness that swallowed it whole, revealing only hints of enormous shapes suspended beyond the reach of his beam. The rails ran forward into this abyss, curving gently as though leading into the heart of a machine too large to be fully seen from any single vantage point. He stood at the edge of the opening, feeling the cold breath of the cavern wash over him, and understood that he had reached a threshold far more significant than the fissure that had first drawn him inside. The cavern swallowed him whole. One moment, he had been standing in the narrow throat of the descending tunnel, hemmed in by stone on all sides, and the next, he was stepping into a chamber so vast that his headlamp seemed to dissolve before it had traveled even a fraction of the distance to the far wall. The sound of his boots on the gravelly floor vanished almost immediately, as though the space itself were absorbing every noise he made. He stopped instinctively, letting his eyes adjust, turning his head slowly from side to side in an effort to build a mental map from the scattered hints his light provided. The rails continued straight into the open darkness, their faint metallic gleam fading into shadow. As he took a few tentative steps forward, the beam of his lamp began to catch on shapes that had no place in a natural cave. Upright posts rose from the floor at irregular intervals, some still standing firm, others leaning or snapped at the base. Between them, remnants of platforms and rail switches lay collapsed in layers, their original geometry only just discernible through the clutter of decay. This was no simple underground chamber. It was a node, a hub in a network that had once pulsed with motion. He followed the rails deeper into the cavern, moving slowly, mindful of unseen hazards. The ground was uneven here, scarred by ruts and channels where carts had once rolled back and forth. In places, the rails disappeared beneath piles of rubble, only to re-emerge several meters later, bending gently to follow the natural contours of the space. His light revealed tracks branching off at shallow angles, each set of rails leading into darker recesses that hinted at additional tunnels beyond the main line. He was standing at the crossroads of an underground road system that had been carved into the mountain with astonishing ambition. As he walked, the cavern began to yield its history. On the far side of a collapsed switch platform, he found a cluster of wooden crates, their lids warped and split by time, but still bearing the faint stenciled marks of long-defunct companies. The lettering was too faded to read, yet the style was unmistakably 19th century, blocky, and utilitarian, meant for workers who valued function over flourish. Nearby lay a stack of rusted metal plates, each pierced with identical holes, the remnants of some mechanical assembly he could only partially imagine. He passed beneath a series of low-hanging beams that had been installed to support the ceiling in sections where the rock had proved unstable. Some were intact, blackened with age, but solid enough to inspire cautious trust. Others had failed spectacularly, snapped or pulled free from their sockets, leaving behind scars in the stone that looked like the mouths of broken teeth. Beneath one such collapse, he found a crushed ore cart, its sides caved inward as though it had been caught beneath a falling wall. The coal dust inside had compacted into a solid mass, preserving the impression of the cart's final load. The sheer scale of the operation became clearer with every step. This was not a modest mine worked by a handful of men. It was an industrial artery designed to move enormous quantities of material, likely feeding furnaces and railways far below the mountain. The rails on which he walked were narrow, but their purpose was unmistakable. They had carried wealth in the form of black rock, hauled from the depths and sent down the cliff face he had climbed, descending a route so improbable it defied belief. At one junction he paused, letting his light sweep across a series of side passages that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. Each bore the marks of human passage, though many were partially blocked by cave-ins that had sealed them long ago. He noticed that some of these secondary tunnels were braced with heavier timber, their beams thicker and more carefully fitted, suggesting areas of particular importance or instability. Others were little more than rough-hewn shafts, carved in haste to follow a promising seam of coal before being abandoned when the vein played out. He chose to remain on the main line, guided by the rails that had brought him this far. As he advanced, he found himself stepping over remnants of everyday life that had once filled this cavern with mundane activity. A battered lunch pail lay half buried in dust near the base of a pillar, its lid rusted shut, a testament to the human rhythms that had once governed this place. A pair of boots, their leather cracked and soles worn thin, rested beside a broken beam, as if someone had set them down with the intention of returning for them after a brief interruption. The notion that these objects had not been lost gradually but left behind all at once grew harder to ignore. Everything here spoke of haste, of a sudden decision to flee that had overridden the instinct to gather personal belongings. Even the tools scattered across the floor seemed to cluster in unnatural patterns, as though dropped mid-motion rather than set aside with care. The mountain had not reclaimed this space slowly. It had swallowed it in a single, decisive act. He approached what looked like the remains of a control station, a raised platform from which the traffic of carts and cables might once have been directed. The wooden decking had collapsed in places, but a rusted framework still stood, its angles suggesting a deliberate vantage point over the network of tracks below. He climbed carefully onto the surviving portion and surveyed the cavern from this elevated position, gaining a clearer sense of its layout. From here, he could see that the main line curved gently toward a massive opening at the far end of the chamber, a dark arch in the stone that dwarfed every other tunnel he had encountered. That opening exhaled cold air in a steady stream, a breath so persistent it stirred the dust at his feet. It was the same draft he had felt earlier, now amplified by the size of the space it emerged from. Whatever lay beyond was not another narrow passage, but something larger still. Perhaps the core around which this entire system had been built. Before he descended from the platform, he noticed a detail that made his stomach tighten. Along the edges of the raised station were grooves worn deep into the wood, parallel to the rails below, evidence of cables or chains that had once been tensioned there. Several of the metal fittings that had anchored them were bent or torn free, their deformation too severe to be explained by rust alone. It was as though immense force had been applied to the system, stretching and snapping components that had been designed to withstand heavy loads. He climbed down and walked toward the far opening, his pace slowing with each step as the implications of what he had seen began to crystallize. This cavern had not merely been abandoned. It had been subjected to a failure, a cascade of mechanical breakdowns that had overwhelmed its builders. The rails, the carts, the cables, all had been part of a delicately balanced network that could only function if every element performed as intended. Something here had gone wrong, and when it did, the consequences had been swift and unforgiving. At the threshold of the massive archway, he stopped again, turning to take one last look at the cavern behind him. The scattered tools, the crushed cart, the empty boots, all seemed to recede into a collective silence, a tableau frozen at the moment of collapse. He felt a strange sense of intrusion, as though he were trespassing not just in a physical space, but in a narrative that did not belong to him. A story of ambition and loss etched into the stone. Then he faced forward once more and stepped into the darkness beyond, following the abandoned road toward the heart of the mountain, where the true machinery of this forgotten enterprise awaited him. The great archway swallowed him with a hush so profound that it felt as though the mountain itself had drawn a breath and decided to keep it. The cold intensified immediately, creeping through the layers of his clothing and settling against his skin with an intimacy that no wind could match. His headlamp beam skimmed across the floor, revealing a smooth descent that carried the rails into an even larger chamber beyond. And as he followed them, he began to grasp the true scale of what had been built here. The space opened gradually, the ceiling lifting higher with each step until it vanished into darkness. The sound of his movement transformed as well, echoing faintly from unseen walls, returning to him with subtle distortions that made it difficult to judge distance or direction. When his light finally caught on something solid, it was not rock, but metal, vast surfaces of it, standing where the mountain had been carved away to make room for machinery. He halted instinctively, heart pounding, and swept the beam of his lamp in a slow arc. What emerged from the darkness defied any simple description. Massive drums, the height of small houses, loomed from the shadows, their cylindrical forms wrapped in layers of rusted cable so thick that a single strand could have filled his hand. The cables fed into towering assemblies of gears and pulleys, their teeth locked in frozen engagement as though they had been arrested mid-turn. The rails he had been following curved inward toward these giants, converging at points where carts would once have been attached to the moving lines of steel. He walked closer, every step cautious, and laid a gloved hand against one of the drums. The metal was so cold it seemed to burn, leaching warmth from his fingers even through the insulated fabric. Flakes of rust came away at his touch, drifting to the floor like dried leaves. He imagined the noise this place must once have generated, the roar of cables under tension, the grinding of gears, the shouts of men coordinating the movement of tons of coal up and down the mountain face. Now there was only the faint drip of condensation somewhere high above, a lonely echo in a cathedral of silence. The engineering on display here was staggering. The drums were not merely anchored to the rock but integrated into it, their housings bolted directly into carved recesses in the mountain wall. Thick iron frames braced them on all sides, their members joined by rivets that had been hammered into place by hands that could never have imagined a future where someone like him would be standing here alone, reading their work like an archaeological text. As he moved among the machinery, he began to notice patterns that spoke of catastrophe rather than decay. Several of the gears were misaligned, their teeth chewed and bent as though they had been forced to mesh under intolerable strain. In one corner of the chamber, a pulley lay half torn from its mount, its axle twisted at an angle that suggested a violent wrenching rather than the slow surrender of corrosion. Beneath it, the stone floor was gouged with deep scars, long grooves that converged toward the rails like claw marks. He followed these marks and found that they led to a section of track that had been driven hard into the rock wall, the metal flanges crushed flat as if the entire system had surged forward in a single, unstoppable motion. It was not difficult to imagine what might have happened. A runaway cart, perhaps several, breaking free on the incline he had descended, slamming into the braking mechanisms here with a force no human design could withstand. The cables would have snapped or jammed, the drums spinning wildly or seizing in place, the men caught in the midst of it scrambling for escape. The thought made the chamber feel suddenly crowded despite its emptiness. He could almost see them in his mind's eye, figures blurred by dust and terror, abandoning their stations as the system failed around them. The sense of urgency that had clung to the abandoned tools and scattered belongings now found its context. This was the heart of the mine, the place where the flow of coal and capital had been regulated, and when it had failed, the entire operation had become untenable. He ventured deeper, weaving between the looming shapes of the machinery, following the rails as they threaded through the chaos. At one point, he found himself standing beneath a colossal gear assembly whose teeth were as tall as his forearm. They were locked together in a position that spoke of violent arrest. One wheel twisted just enough out of plane to suggest it had been forced to stop abruptly while its partner had continued to push. The strain of that moment seemed to linger in the metal, frozen forever in the shape of damage. On the far side of the chamber, he discovered a smaller room carved into the wall, its entrance framed by a pair of iron supports that had fared better than most. He stepped inside and found what must once have been a control room. A bank of levers stood against one wall, their handles worn smooth by use, some frozen in mid-position as though abandoned in the midst of an emergency. Gauges were mounted above them, their glass faces clouded but still legible enough to reveal needles pegged at the extreme ends of their ranges. He leaned closer to one of the gauges, angling his headlamp to peer through the grime. The scale was marked in units he recognized only vaguely, but the needle was jammed far beyond the maximum, a mute testimony to pressures that had exceeded the design limits of the system. It was another piece of the puzzle, a confirmation that the failure here had not been gentle or gradual, but sudden and overwhelming. Back in the main chamber, he noticed something he had not seen before. A set of heavy doors recessed into the stone behind one of the drums. They were closed, their surfaces mottled with rust but otherwise intact, and a faded stencil on one panel hinted at their original purpose. He could not read the words, but the format was unmistakable, a warning or designation intended for workers who had long since turned to dust. He approached slowly, the instinct to tread lightly returning with renewed force. The floor in front of the doors was littered with debris that looked different from the rest of the chamber, not the random scattering of collapse, but a more deliberate accumulation, as though items had been piled there in a hurry. Wooden crates lay stacked haphazardly, some broken open to reveal their contents, others sealed but stained by dark, irregular patches that glistened faintly in the beam of his light. A sharp, unfamiliar scent reached him, cutting through the pervasive smell of coal and rust. It was chemical, acrid, and it made the inside of his nose prickle. He slowed even further, scanning the area for clues before moving closer. The crates were marked with symbols he recognized from his limited knowledge of mining history, indicators for explosives used to blast new tunnels and break stubborn seams of coal. His heart rate spiked, and he found himself holding his breath as he took the last few steps toward the nearest box. The wood was damp to the touch despite the dryness of the air, and as his light played across its surface, he saw what had been catching his eye from a distance. The dark patches were not rot or mold, but beads of moisture, tiny droplets forming and sliding slowly down the grain. Around the edges of the boards and the heads of the nails, delicate crystalline structures had begun to grow, translucent and irregular, like frost that refused to melt. The implications hit him with a force that eclipsed every other danger he had faced on this journey. These were not just old explosives forgotten in a forgotten mine. They were unstable, actively degrading into something far more volatile than when they had been sealed away. He knew enough to understand that the crystals he was seeing were a symptom of nitroglycerin seeping from its absorbent matrix, a process that rendered the material dangerously sensitive to vibration, shock, even temperature change. He froze, his body instinctively locking in place as though he had stumbled upon a sleeping predator. Every breath felt like a risk, every shift of weight a potential trigger. The heart of the mine was no longer merely a monument to industrial ambition. It was a bomb, patiently waiting for the smallest excuse to detonate. Slowly, with movements so careful they bordered on ritual, he began to retreat, his eyes never leaving the sweating crates as he eased back along the rails. The vast machinery around him seemed suddenly malevolent, its silent bulk a reminder of the forces that had once been unleashed here and could be again in an instant. He had come seeking the story of a forgotten railway. He had found instead a legacy of danger that could not be left undisturbed. He did not remember beginning to move. There was no clear decision, no moment when his mind told his muscles what to do. His body simply understood the danger before his thoughts could catch up, and he found himself easing backward along the rails with the deliberation of someone retreating from a precipice. The beam of his headlamp remained fixed on the nearest crate, its surface slick with moisture that had no business existing in a place this cold and dry. Each crystal clinging to the wood glinted like a shard of glass, beautiful in a way that made his skin crawl. The chemical smell was stronger now that he was so close, sharp and faintly sweet at the same time, a scent that lodged in the back of his throat and refused to leave. He forced himself to breathe shallowly, terrified that even the expansion of his chest might be enough to jostle the floor beneath him. The mountain felt suddenly fragile, as though the centuries of stone pressing down on this chamber were being held in place by the thinnest margin of stability. He took another step back, then another, his boots finding the same spots they had occupied moments before. The rails hummed faintly beneath his weight, not with any actual vibration, but with the echo of tension reverberating through his own nerves. It was an absurd thought that a structure so ancient could still transmit anything at all, yet in that moment he was convinced he could feel every microscopic shift traveling through the iron, seeking the volatile heart of the crates he had disturbed. He did not turn away from them until he had put several meters between himself and the sealed door, and even then he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a flash of light, or feel the concussive force of an explosion that would end everything before he had time to register it. The machinery he had admired only minutes earlier now loomed as a threat, every massive gear and rusted drum a potential amplifier for disaster. As he retreated into the open space of the cavern, the cold air seemed to loosen its grip on him just enough for his thoughts to begin assembling into something like coherence. The signs he had noticed in passing took on new weight, fitting together into a pattern that was no longer abstract. The sudden abandonment, the broken cables, the damaged control systems, all of it pointed toward a moment when the operation had become too dangerous to continue. Perhaps a runaway cart had slammed into the breaking assembly, rupturing the storage area behind it, allowing chemicals to leak and degrade. Perhaps the men had fled when they realized what was happening, leaving behind materials that would grow more unstable with each passing year. He leaned against a pillar and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, grounding himself in the sensation of solid stone beneath his palm. When he opened them again, he forced himself to take in the environment not as a climber or an explorer, but as someone responsible for what he had uncovered. The mountain did not care about human curiosity. The crates would not grow safer if ignored. If anything, the disturbance he had already caused might be enough to hasten a catastrophe. He began to backtrack along the path he had followed into the chamber, now seeing it through a lens of urgency that had been absent before. The crushed ore cart near the collapsed beam was no longer merely an artifact. It was a clue, perhaps a casualty of the same event that had turned the storage room into a ticking hazard. He skirted it carefully, mindful of the way the floor dipped and rose around the debris, each unevenness a reminder of how precarious his footing was. The draft from the main archway felt like a promise of escape as he reached it, though he knew he was far from safe. The rails led him back toward the network of tunnels he had navigated to reach this place, and he followed them with a focus that bordered on obsession, memorizing each bend, each distinctive scar in the wall, each abandoned tool that could serve as a landmark. If he were to make it out alive, he would need to be able to guide others back here without hesitation, and the labyrinth he was leaving behind did not lend itself to easy recollection. As he re-entered the broader cavern of the abandoned road, the echoes of his footsteps felt louder than before, reverberating through the space with a hollow insistence that made him flinch despite himself. He imagined the shock waves of an explosion propagating through these same voids, turning the mountain into a bell struck by a giant's hammer. The thought was enough to make him pick up his pace despite the danger of moving too quickly. He paused only once at the raised control platform from which he had first surveyed the cavern, and looked back toward the archway that concealed the heart of the mine. From this distance, there was nothing to distinguish it from the dozens of other openings that pocked the walls, yet he knew that behind that darkness lay a cluster of crates, slowly turning into something capable of tearing the mountain open. The weight of that knowledge settled over him with an almost physical force. The return through the narrower passages was a trial of restraint. The downward tunnel that had carried him toward discovery now had to be climbed, and he took it in small, deliberate increments, bracing himself against the walls, testing each foothold before committing his weight. The confined space magnified his anxiety, every scrape of fabric against rock sounding like a prelude to disaster. He forced himself to move in the same careful rhythm he would use on a delicate lead climb, trusting the process rather than his racing thoughts. The chamber where the broken beams and frayed cable lay seemed even more ominous on the way back. He picked his way around the debris, resisting the urge to hurry, knowing that haste was more dangerous here than caution. Beyond it, the fissure that had first threatened to trap him loomed once more, its jagged walls closing in with the same indifference they had shown when he entered. He slid sideways through it, his pack scraping softly despite his efforts, and emerged into the earlier section of tunnel with a rush of relief that made his knees tremble. Only when he reached the point where the rails began to diverge and the tunnel widened slightly did he allow himself to stop. He rested his forehead against the cold stone, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline bleed out of his system. He had escaped the immediate danger, but the knowledge he carried was heavier than any pack. Somewhere above him, behind the rock he had climbed without a second thought, lay a cache of decaying explosives capable of destroying everything around them. He could not leave them there and pretend he had never seen them. When he finally resumed his ascent towards the fissure that led back to the cliff face, it was with a new sense of purpose. Every step now was part of a larger task, one that extended beyond his own survival. He was not just finding his way out of a mountain, he was carrying a warning, and the mountain, indifferent as it was, had entrusted him with the burden of making sure its buried danger did not claim anyone else. The fissure that led back to the cliff face felt narrower than it had on the way in, its jagged sides closing around him with an intimacy that was almost suffocating. He had to pause several times just to steady his breathing, letting his heart beat slow enough that he could move without trembling. The thought of the crates sweating nitroglycerin crystals somewhere below pressed against his mind like a physical weight, making every scrape of his pack against the stone feel intolerably loud. When he finally forced his way through the last constriction and felt the bite of outside air on his face, the sensation was almost disorienting. The wind roared past the opening, carrying with it fine needles of ice that stung his cheeks and blurred his vision. He clung to the rock with numbed fingers and looked down at the void beneath his boots, momentarily stunned by the return of scale. The mountain that had seemed like a closed world only minutes earlier was once again an endless drop, the familiar terror of exposure replacing the enclosed dread of the tunnels. He secured himself to the nearest piece of protection he could find, a narrow crack that accepted a cam with grudging reliability, and allowed his body to sag against the rope. The exertion of the climb, the cold, and the mental strain combined to leave him shaking, his legs threatening to betray him if he moved too quickly. He forced himself to go through the motions he had practiced 1,000 times, checking knots, adjusting straps, turning his headlamp off to conserve the batteries he would need later. The weather had worsened while he was inside. A low ceiling of cloud had descended over the upper reaches of the wall, swallowing the summit and erasing what little sense of direction he had left. Snow hissed against the rock in fitful gusts, and the temperature had dropped enough that the moisture froze instantly on contact, glazing holds that had been merely slick when he started. He knew he could not simply reverse his route down the face. The section he had climbed to reach the fissure was too delicate, too exposed to falling ice, to be trusted in these conditions. Instead, he angled away from the rails that had guided him upward, traversing cautiously across a band of fractured stone in search of a safer descent line he had noticed during his initial ascent. Each move was a negotiation with gravity, his muscles protesting the demand for precision after hours of tension. He was acutely aware that he was no longer climbing for the sake of the climb. He was retreating from something that wanted to remain hidden, and that knowledge sharpened his focus even as it gnawed at his nerves. When he finally reached a ledge broad enough to stand on without clinging to the wall, he allowed himself to stop. He fumbled with his pack, his fingers stiff with cold, and dug out the emergency beacon he carried for exactly this kind of situation. The device felt absurdly small in his hand, given the scale of the problem he was about to describe, but it was all he had. The signal struggled to punch through the surrounding stone and weather, but eventually he felt the faint vibration that told him it had connected. He relayed the coordinates of the fissure as precisely as he could, anchoring them to recognizable features on the cliff face and in the surrounding terrain. He described the rails embedded in the wall, the tunnel system, the massive machinery hidden inside the mountain, and, finally, the crates, the sweating wood, the crystals that had no business existing. He did not need to dramatize the danger. The words themselves were enough. When the connection ended, he remained on the ledge for several minutes, staring out into the swirling gray where the world beyond the mountain had vanished. He had done what he could. The rest would be out of his hands, dependent on people who had not stood where he stood or smelled what he had smelled. The thought made him uneasy, but there was no alternative. The descent that followed was one of the hardest he could remember. The wind strengthened as the afternoon wore on, screaming through the gullies and plastering the rock with spindrift that erased his chalk marks and turned familiar features into indistinguishable white smears. He moved by instinct and memory, following the subtle curves of the stone, trusting that the mountain had not changed too much in the hours he had spent inside it. At one point he slipped, his boot skidding on a patch of ice where he had expected rough stone. The rope came tight with a snap that jolted him to the core, and he hung there for a breathless second, staring down at the emptiness below before hauling himself back to the wall with a grunt of effort. The realization that he could still die here, despite having escaped the most insidious danger, drove home how thin the margin for error truly was. By the time he reached the lower sections of the face, dusk had begun to seep into the air, draining color from the landscape and replacing it with a monotone that made depth perception unreliable. He pressed on regardless, driven by the need to put as much distance as possible between himself and the fissure before night fell completely. The trees at the base of the wall appeared suddenly out of the gloom, their dark silhouettes rising to meet him like a crowd of silent witnesses. He staggered into the shelter of the forest just as the first stars began to pierce the cloud cover overhead. The wind died abruptly among the trunks, leaving behind a stillness that rang in his ears after hours of noise. He leaned against a pine and closed his eyes, letting the rough bark bite through his jacket and anchor him in the present. The path back to his makeshift camp was little more than a memory now, a series of impressions left by his approach days earlier, but he followed it with stubborn determination, guided by the shape of the terrain and the feel of the ground beneath his boots. When he finally reached the shallow depression where he had slept before the climb, he did not bother to set up his bivouac properly. He crawled into his sleeping bag, fully clothed, and lay there in the dark, replaying the day in his mind, the image of the sweating crates refusing to fade. Sometime in the night, he woke to the distant thrum of rotors echoing through the valley, a sound so out of place in this forgotten wilderness that it took him several seconds to recognize it. He sat up, fumbling for his headlamp, and stepped out into the cold to watch a helicopter's searchlight sweep across the lower slopes of the mountain. The authorities had not wasted time. Relief washed over him, tempered by the knowledge that the mountain was now someone else's problem. He had escaped, but the story he carried was only beginning to unfold. The helicopter did not land that night. It circled the valley in wide, deliberate loops, its searchlight sweeping across the lower slopes and the dark forest like an eye that could not quite decide what it was seeing. The beam slid over snowfields and boulder fans, caught the sharp angles of deadfall, then climbed the cliff face in slow arcs until it reached the band of rock where the fissure lay hidden. From the ground, the light seemed to pause there, lingering as if the mountain itself had drawn it in. Then the beam moved on, continuing its methodical search. The sound of the rotors faded and returned, fading and returning, until at last it drifted off into the distance and the valley fell back into silence. He slept only in fragments after that. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the damp wood and the translucent crystals clinging to it like frost that had learned to survive. He felt again the irrational certainty that the mountain was listening, that the mind's heart was not inert but waiting, and that every minute increased the odds of someone wandering too close. Long before dawn, he gave up on rest entirely. He packed slowly, hands stiff with cold, and stepped out into the gray light with the kind of exhaustion that made the world feel slightly unreal. By mid-morning, the valley began to change. The first sound was not the helicopter but the distant crunch of tires, a noise that should not have existed in this untracked wilderness. Then came the low rumble of engines idling far below the ridgeline, followed by voices, short and clipped, carried on the wind in scattered fragments. He saw movement through the trees, figures in heavy gear, the bright patches of safety colors, equipment cases being hauled over uneven ground by people who moved with practiced purpose. They were not climbers in search of a summit. They were professionals responding to a problem that did not belong to the ordinary world. When they reached him, they did not ask for stories. They asked for specifics. He gave them everything he had, forcing his mind to organize details that had felt chaotic in the moment. He described the rails embedded in the cliff, the angle of the fissure, the slope of the tunnels, the wide cavern where the tracks branched, the enormous winch room and its frozen machinery. He described the recessed doors behind one of the drums, the stacked crates, the beaded moisture on the wood, and the crystals at the seams. He watched their faces as he spoke, saw the subtle shift that occurred when the abstract became concrete, when the words nitroglycerin and crystals formed a picture none of them wanted to see. The initial response was cautious by necessity. A perimeter went up in stages, first informal, then unmistakable. Access points were blocked and marked. Radios crackled with instructions. A small command post took shape on a flat patch of ground where the forest opened enough for equipment to be staged. The atmosphere felt at once urgent and restrained, as if everyone understood that haste could make things worse. He was given water, then something hot, then wrapped in additional insulation he barely noticed. His role shifted from discoverer to witness, then to liability they needed to manage. They did not treat him with suspicion, but they treated the mountain with respect that bordered on fear. A team of technical climbers moved first, not to enter, but to verify. They approached the cliff with the same careful discipline he had used, though their movements were heavier under the weight of additional gear. From below, he watched them ascend in short, controlled pitches, placing protection with the deliberation of people who knew that one careless strike of metal against stone could ripple into catastrophe. When they reached the section he had indicated, the group paused. Even from a distance he could see them studying the rock face, heads turning, hands tracing lines. One of them leaned in close to the wall and brushed away snow. Then, unmistakably, he saw the climber's posture change, the subtle stiffening that said the unbelievable had become real. After that, the pace accelerated, though never into recklessness. More specialists arrived, and with them came the language of engineering and risk. They talked about stability and vibration, about the unpredictability of old dynamite, about crystals that could form when nitroglycerin separated and migrated. They talked about the likelihood of additional caches deeper in the system, about the possibility of collapse, cutting off retreat, about how the mountain's own settling could have been enough to trigger a detonation at any time. He listened, absorbing the fact that what he had feared was not paranoia, but probability. The mine had been sleeping on a fault line of chemistry and time. The most unsettling part was how quickly the place became two things at once. To him, it had been a secret, a forgotten scar in the mountain revealed by accident. To them, it became an incident site, a location with coordinates and protocols, a problem that needed to be neutralized. Yet, there was also a third dimension they did not say aloud. They understood, as he did, that secrecy itself was a kind of safety. If word got out that a hidden mine existed with rails running into a cliff and massive machinery frozen inside, curiosity would drag people here with a force as relentless as gravity. No warning sign could compete with that kind of temptation. The decision to close the area came quickly, and it came wrapped in language designed to discourage questions. They spoke of hazardous geological conditions, of unstable rock bands, and the risk of sudden collapse. They used terms that sounded technical enough to end arguments and vague enough to hide the truth. Rangers were pulled in, and with them came the authority to enforce boundaries that until now had been theoretical. The closure did not feel like a simple prohibition. It felt like an admission that the mountain had become something different. Not wilderness, but a concealed weapon. While the public-facing explanation took shape, the real work happened in the planning circles that formed behind the command post. Engineers evaluated what could be done and what could not. The bomb technicians were blunt in their assessments. Removing the crates was not simply dangerous. It was, in practical terms, impossible. The route to the storage area involved narrow tunnels, steep inclines, unstable supports, and an enormous winch room full of metal that could transmit vibration. Any attempt to carry or drag the explosives out would require repeated movement through tight spaces, contact with walls, adjustments of load, shifts of balance. Even if they could reach the crates without triggering them, the act of handling them would itself be a gamble no one could justify. They considered options that sounded like compromises, but were really degrees of the same conclusion. Neutralize in place, isolate, prevent access forever. The mountain would not let them dismantle the past gently, so they would have to end it decisively. Before any detonation could be planned, they needed to understand the system well enough to avoid turning the entire slope into a cascade of rock and snow. Teams worked from different angles. Climbers mapped what they could of the cliff face, identifying the fissure and other potential weak points. Others scanned for old openings lower on the slope, evidence of ventilation shafts or collapsed entrances that might offer alternate access. Geologists examined the rock bands, looking for signs of fracture lines that could propagate under shock. They spoke about the risk of triggering a slide, about how a blast inside a chamber could punch outward through weaknesses and send debris down into the valley. The mountain was not simply a container. It was a structure, and structures responded to force in ways that could surprise even experts. At some point, he realized he was being kept at a careful distance. Not out of distrust, but because he was not a part of the machine now. Yet, he remained tethered to it by the fact that his memory of the tunnels was the most complete map anyone had. They asked him to describe landmarks again and again, each time with slightly different emphasis. Where did the main track split? How steep was the descent after the chamber with broken beams? How far from the winch drums were the doors with the crates? Did the air draft come from behind the machinery or from a separate shaft? He answered until his voice went hoarse, forcing his mind to replay images that made his stomach tighten. The plan that emerged was as cautious as it was final. They would not attempt to clear the mine. They would not attempt to stabilize it for future study. They would treat it as a hazard to be sealed, its contents to be destroyed in the safest way available. That meant a controlled blast, not improvised but calculated, designed to do two things at once: detonate or disrupt the unstable explosives and collapse the access route so thoroughly that no one could enter again without extraordinary effort. The work of preparing for that took days, and those days felt strangely unreal, as if the mountain had stepped outside normal time. The camp expanded, then settled into routines. Equipment moved up and down. Small teams went out in the morning and returned by late afternoon, their faces tight with cold and concentration. There were moments when he caught glimpses of the mine's entrance area on a monitor, grainy footage from a camera placed near the fissure, the cliff face reduced to pixels and annotated by hands that did not want to risk being close. The rails were visible in those images, thin, dark lines disappearing into rock, looking almost delicate. He knew what lay behind them. Delicacy was an illusion. On the morning of the blast, the weather was calmer than it had been since his climb. The sky was a hard, pale blue, and the air carried a brittle clarity that made distant ridges look close enough to touch. It felt like the mountain was offering perfect conditions, indifferent to the human drama it had set in motion. The technicians moved with methodical precision, their movements rehearsed, their voices clipped and sparse. There was no excitement in the air. There was the quiet gravity of people about to strike a match in a room full of gas, relying on mathematics and experience to prevent disaster. He was positioned far enough away to be safe, yet close enough to feel the tension of the moment. From his vantage point, he could see the lower portion of the cliff face and the band where the fissure lay, though the opening itself was too small to stand out without knowing exactly where to look. The team had chosen their ignition point carefully. They were not simply detonating from outside and hoping for the best. They had placed charges in a way that would direct force inward and downward, collapsing key sections of the access corridor and severing the rail line so completely that even the visible traces on the cliff would become meaningless. The final countdown was not theatrical. It was a series of confirmations, a chain of responsibility passed from one person to another in calm voices. Then there was a pause, a breath held by an entire group of people who had trained for moments like this, still could not entirely domesticate the instinct to fear it. The explosion came not as a sharp crack, but as a deep, rolling concussion that seemed to rise from within the mountain itself. For a fraction of a second, the world went silent, as if sound had been punched out of the air, and then the shock reached them like a wave. The ground trembled under his boots. Snow shivered loose from branches and fell in soft cascades. A muffled roar followed, swelling and fading as it traveled through the rock. He watched the cliff face, expecting fire or flying debris, but what happened was subtler and more ominous. A dark plume of dust pushed outward from the fissure area, not a violent eruption, but a steady exhalation as internal chambers collapsed. The plume rose, drifted, then thinned in the cold air. A few seconds later, a second tremor rippled through the ground, smaller than the first, like an afterthought. Somewhere inside, the mountain rearranged itself, stone shifted into voids that had been empty for too long. When it was over, the cliff looked almost unchanged from his distance. That was part of the point. The destruction had happened inside, where it needed to. The mountain had been sealed not with concrete or metal, but with its own substance, collapsed rock filling the corridors that had once been carved by men who believed they could master it. The aftermath was not immediate celebration, because there was still the matter of certainty. Instruments were checked, readings were taken. Specialists listened to the mountain in the ways their professions allowed, interpreting subtle vibrations and echoes that told them whether secondary collapses were still occurring. There were hours of waiting in which no one moved too close, because impatience could still turn victory into tragedy. Only when they were confident that the internal system had settled did they send small teams back toward the cliff to inspect what could be seen. The fissure was no longer a fissure in any meaningful sense. It had been choked with debris, the narrow opening packed with broken stone and crushed timbers that had once formed the mine's inner skeleton. The rails that had guided him inward were twisted and broken at the threshold, their ends buried, their continuity severed. Even if someone knew where to look, even if they had the will to try, the entrance no longer offered passage. It offered only a scar, sealed by force. What happened next was as important as the blast itself, and it spoke to a kind of practical wisdom that had nothing to do with heroism. The authorities did not want breadcrumbs left behind. They did not want the faint metallic glint on the cliff face to become an invitation. Over the following days, teams worked to remove or conceal the visible portions of the rail system outside. Some sections were cut away where it could be done safely. Others were buried under rockfall deliberately induced from above, a controlled reshaping of the face to erase the line his eyes had followed. In certain places, they stained the newly exposed rock with material that would weather naturally, allowing time and snow to finish the disguise. The goal was not only to stop entry, it was to stop curiosity. The closure remained, formalized now with boundaries that would outlast the temporary camp. Notices were posted in ways that did not advertise the real reason. A few locals grumbled at the loss of access, attributing it to bureaucracy, to overcaution, to the usual tensions between wilderness and regulation. Those who complained did not know what lay beneath their boots. They did not know that the mountain had carried a century-old threat like a splinter under skin, waiting for a single careless touch. When the camp finally dismantled and the valley returned to its earlier stillness, he felt a strange emptiness settle into him. For days, he had lived in a world where every conversation circled the same core, where the mine was not a rumor but an immediate presence, where the mountain's secret had shaped the movements of dozens of people. Now that presence was gone, sealed into stone, reduced again to something the world would not acknowledge. He hiked out alone, as he had hiked in, though the solitude felt different now. The forest looked the same, the snowfields unchanged, the ridges indifferent. Yet he carried with him the memory of the machinery, the frozen drums, the ruined gauges, the sweat on old wood that should have been dry. He carried the knowledge that the past did not always remain safely in the past, that old ambitions could leave behind hazards that outlived the men who created them by generations. Back in the nearest town, he gave a final statement, signed forms, answered the last questions asked by people who wanted clean conclusions. He noticed how carefully they avoided certain words. There would be no headlines about a hidden mine filled with unstable explosives. There would be no public fascination with rails vanishing into a cliff. The official story would be simpler, safer, and, in its own way, truer than a sensational one. The area was closed because it was dangerous. That was all anyone needed to know. Weeks later, when life had resumed its ordinary rhythm, he found that the mountain had not released him as completely as he wanted. In quiet moments, he would feel again the cold air of the tunnels, hear the faint echo of his own breathing, see the crystals glittering in his lamp's beam. He understood, then, that he had not merely stumbled upon an artifact. He had stepped into a moment of history that had been suspended, waiting for someone to pull it into the present. The men who built those rails and that machinery had likely believed their work would endure as triumph. Instead, it had endured as danger. Yet there was a measure of peace in knowing it was sealed. The mountain would keep its secret again, this time not by neglect but by design. Snow would fall, melt, fall again. Wind would carve new lines across the cliff face. Lichen would spread over fresh scars. In a decade, the place might look as untouched as any other remote wall in the Rockies. In a century, the story might be nothing more than an odd rumor traded by climbers who liked mysteries. And beneath it all, deep inside stone that had been rearranged by controlled violence, the mine would remain buried, its deadly inheritance rendered inert by destruction and collapse. On the last day he could see the peak from the road, he pulled over and stood at the edge of the trees, looking up. The summit was clear in the winter light, sharp against a pale sky, serene enough to convince anyone that nothing unnatural had ever existed within it. He watched for a long time, letting the scale of it settle in his chest. He had come for a climb, for the purity of a line on rock, for the quiet proof that he could still trust his hands and his judgment. He was leaving with something heavier and less tangible, the understanding that wilderness was not always innocent, and that sometimes the most responsible thing a person could do with a discovery was to make sure no one ever found it again. Then he turned away, the cold air filling his lungs, and walked back into the ordinary world, while the mountain stood behind him, silent and sealed, keeping its secret beneath the rock forever. Before you go, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Watch our other stories right now and share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries hidden in the wild.